Welcome to the stories where pets and people always have the last laugh against unfair rules. The HOA claimed my golden retriever was too big to live in the community, threatening fines and even legal action. But when I uncovered contradictions in their own bylaws, their scheme unraveled, exposing corruption, mismanagement, and ultimately leading to their downfall. What began as a battle to save my dog turned into a fight that freed an entire neighborhood from an abusive HOA. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found the perfect place. The houses were neatly aligned, the lawns were well kept, and the streets were quiet enough for morning jogs and evening walks. It felt like the kind of suburban dream I had always imagined. But what truly made it feel like home was Max, my golden retriever. He wasn't just a pet, he was family. Loyal, gentle, and endlessly playful, Max had been with me through thick and thin. At first, the neighbors seemed friendly enough. A few of them waved whenever I walked Max down the street, and kids often stopped to pet him. It didn't take long for me to settle in, believing this neighborhood would be a peaceful chapter in my life. That illusion shattered the morning I found an envelope taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was a misplaced flyer or a neighborly note. But the bold HOA letterhead across the top made my stomach drop. I opened it right there on the porch, and as my eyes scanned the words, a mix of confusion and anger started to boil inside me. The letter stated that animals over 25 pounds were prohibited within the community boundaries, citing a section of the HOA bylaws I had never even seen before. The letter went further, warning me that if I did not remove the dog from the premises within 14 days, I would face daily fines, escalating penalties, and even possible legal action. I stood there in disbelief, Max wagging his tail at my side, completely unaware of the storm about to descend on both of us. He had never been anything but well-behaved. He didn't bark excessively, didn't cause damage, and had never shown aggression. The idea that he was suddenly illegal in my own home was beyond absurd. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to connect. Just a week before, one particular neighbor, a woman I had heard referred to as the Queen of Complaints, had scowled at Max while I walked him past her yard. Her reputation was well known around the block, petty, power-hungry, and obsessed with enforcing rules nobody else cared about. I realized then that this was her doing. Still, I decided to be rational. I reread my homeowner documents, searching for the clause they referenced. Buried deep in fine print was indeed a section about pet restrictions, but it was vague, outdated, and conflicting with other parts of the bylaws. In fact, another clause allowed pets as long as they were not a nuisance or safety risk. Max clearly fit that description, he was neither. For the next few days, I tried to keep calm. I thought maybe I could reason with the board, explain the situation, and have it resolved without conflict. But that hope didn't last long. Just 3 days later, another letter arrived, this one harsher, more threatening. It accused me of non-compliance and demanded proof that Max was no longer in the home. They even warned that fines of $100 per day would begin immediately if I did not act. It was no longer just about rules. It was intimidation, plain and simple. My anger grew, but so did my resolve. I had worked hard for this home. Max had every right to live here. I wasn't about to let a power-tripping HOA and one bitter neighbor decide the fate of my dog. I started documenting everything. I took photos of Max being calm in the yard. I saved every letter, every notice. I even began recording my walks with him, capturing friendly interactions with neighbors who clearly had no problem with him. If they wanted to play games, I would be ready. By the end of the second week, the fines started appearing as pending charges in my HOA account. They were actually trying to bill me hundreds of dollars for the simple act of keeping my dog. That was the final straw. I wasn't going to back down. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one. And I had a plan forming, one that would turn their own rules and arrogance back on them in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The HOA thought they could bully me. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As I closed the binder where I had started collecting evidence, I looked at Max, peacefully asleep at my feet. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about standing up to an unfair system that thought it could control everything. I had no clue just how messy things were about to get, but one thing was certain, this battle had only just begun. The first week after the fines began felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Every day I checked the HOA portal, and every day the balance due ticked higher, climbing into the hundreds, then thousands. It was like they were trying to bleed me dry, counting on me to give up, give in, and send Max away. But they didn't understand something fundamental. You can threaten a lot of things in life, but you don't mess with someone's family. And Max was family. I knew my next step had to be gathering allies. The HOA thrived on intimidation, but they also counted on silence, neighbors too afraid to speak up. So I started talking. Quietly, at first. Casual chats during evening walks, or when I passed someone working in their yard. I asked if they had ever had issues with the board. To my surprise, the stories poured out like water bursting through a dam. One neighbor told me about being fined for having a garden gnome visible from the street. Another shared how they were forced to repaint their house twice in 2 years because the HOA president decided the color was fading. Someone else recounted how their teenage son was nearly banned from playing basketball in their own driveway because of noise complaints. The more I listened, the clearer it became. Max was just their latest excuse. The board had been running unchecked for years, using rules as weapons, turning homeowners into prisoners in their own properties. People hated it, but most just paid the fines to avoid confrontation. That wasn't going to be me. With each story, I grew more determined. I asked a few of the most frustrated neighbors if they'd be willing to go on record. Some hesitated, afraid of retaliation. But a handful agreed, tired of the nonsense and eager for change. Slowly, I started building a coalition not just about saving Max, but about standing up to the HOA itself. Meanwhile, the letters from the board became more aggressive. They accused me of willful defiance and setting a dangerous precedent. They even threatened to place a lien on my house. That one made me laugh out loud, bitterly. Imagine losing your home because of a golden retriever that does nothing but nap in the sun and wag his tail at strangers. But I knew better than to let anger cloud my strategy. This wasn't just about arguing, it was about proof. So I dove deep into the HOA bylaws. Page after page, clause after clause, I studied every word. And the deeper I went, the more I realized just how sloppy they had been. Their rules contradicted each other constantly. The pet restriction they cited against Max? It wasn't even enforceable, because another section allowed pets as long as they didn't pose health, safety, or nuisance concerns. On top of that, the board had failed to update their bylaws in years, meaning half the rules were outdated under state law. And there it was, the loophole I needed. Not only was Max protected by the very wording of their own documents, but the board itself was operating in violation of its legal obligations. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted my first official response. It wasn't just a polite letter, it was a declaration of war. I outlined the contradictions in their documents, cited state law, and made it clear that their fines were unlawful. I told them that unless they rescinded the penalties immediately, I would pursue legal action not only to protect my rights, but to expose their mismanagement of the entire association. I sent the letter by certified mail, making sure I had proof of delivery. And then I waited. The silence was deafening. No response for 3 days. No letters, no calls. Just quiet. I thought, for a moment, that maybe they had realized they were in the wrong. But that fantasy ended when I received a thick envelope in the mail. It wasn't just another fine notice, it was a formal cease and desist order. According to them, my accusations were baseless, and my refusal to comply was putting the community at risk. They gave me one final warning: remove Max or face legal consequences. It was clear they weren't backing down. If anything, they were doubling down, confident I would break under pressure. But what they didn't know was that I was already preparing for the next step. That evening, I gathered my evidence binder, copies of my neighbors' stories, and the stack of letters they had sent me. I placed them neatly on my desk, next to a folder labeled attorney. I hadn't contacted one yet, but the time was coming soon. Max, as usual, had no idea of the storm raging around him. He curled up by my chair, snoring softly, as if reminding me why this fight mattered. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't even about money. It was about justice, and about showing the HOA that they couldn't bully people into submission. But before I called a lawyer, I had one more card to play. Something that would put public pressure on them, something they couldn't silence behind closed doors. I had a plan to shine a spotlight so bright on their behavior that even they wouldn't be able to wriggle out of it. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to take this fight from the shadows of boardrooms into the open where everyone could see. By the time the third week rolled around, I knew quiet letters and polite exchanges weren't going to cut it. The HOA had already made up their minds. They wanted Max gone, and they were willing to escalate this to the point of absurdity. So if they were going to play hardball, then I would too. And my next move was simple: take the fight public. It started small. I wrote a long, detailed post about my situation on the neighborhood's unofficial online forum, the one not controlled by the HOA. I explained everything: the fines, the letters, the contradictions in the bylaws, and the way Max was being targeted for nothing more than existing. I wasn't ranting, I was methodical. I laid out the evidence like a lawyer presenting a case, attaching photos of Max lying peacefully in the yard, copies of the notices, and snippets from the rules that directly contradicted each other. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in from neighbors, some who I had never even spoken to before. Many expressed outrage. Others shared their own horror stories with the HOA, confirming what I had already learned: this wasn't just about me. The board had been abusing power for years, and most people were sick of it. One neighbor recounted how she had been fined for having her trash bins visible for 10 extra minutes after pickup. Another said he'd been warned that his American flag was too large for the guidelines. Someone else mentioned that the HOA had forced them to remove a swing set because it didn't meet aesthetic standards. As the stories piled up, a picture emerged of an HOA that thrived on intimidation and control. And now, for the first time, people were starting to push back. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to a local community Facebook group that had thousands of members from surrounding neighborhoods. I posted my story there too, carefully worded, backed up with evidence. Once again, the response was massive. People outside my neighborhood were shocked by the ridiculousness of it all. Some offered advice. Others tagged local reporters, suggesting this was exactly the kind of story that needed media attention. By the next day, my inbox was full of messages. Neighbors offering to sign petitions. People asking how they could help. A few even suggested starting a recall of the entire board. The HOA's little power play had just turned into a community-wide scandal, and I was right in the middle of it. Of course, the board didn't take it well. Within 48 hours of my first post, I received another letter, this one dripping with fury. They accused me of defamation and warned that publicizing the dispute was a violation of community policy. They threatened further legal action if I didn't take down the posts immediately. But here's the thing: once the story was out, there was no pulling it back. People were talking, sharing, and rallying. The board had lost control of the narrative. And then came the turning point. A local news outlet reached out to me. One of their reporters had seen the story circulating online and wanted to cover it. They said cases like this were becoming more common: HOAs overstepping their authority, bullying homeowners, and causing unnecessary drama. They asked if I'd be willing to go on record. I hesitated for about 5 seconds before saying yes. The interview was filmed right in my living room, with Max sitting loyally by my side. I explained everything to the camera: the letters, the fines, the intimidation. I showed the reporter the evidence binder I had been compiling, flipping through pages of documents, each one proof of the board's incompetence and hypocrisy. And of course, I made sure to emphasize Max's gentle nature, pointing out that he had never been a nuisance or a threat. The segment aired a few days later, and when it did, it felt like a tidal wave crashing down on the HOA.
My phone lit up with messages from people all over the city. Some cheered me on, others shared their own HOA nightmares, and a few even offered pro bono legal advice. The support was overwhelming, and I knew the board had to be panicking. I heard through the grapevine that the HOA president, who also happened to be the same neighbor who had scowled at Max that day, was furious. She was calling emergency meetings, scrambling to figure out how to control the damage. But it was too late. The spotlight was on them, and they couldn't hide anymore. The very next week, I attended the monthly HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings were sparsely attended, maybe 5 or 6 people at most. But that night? The room was packed. Dozens of neighbors showed up, many carrying copies of my posts, some holding signs that read "Save Max" and "Stop the Fines." The board members sat stiffly at the front, clearly rattled by the unexpected turnout. I didn't even have to say much. The neighbors did the talking for me. One by one, they stood up and shared their frustrations, their anger, their disbelief at the petty rules and abusive fines. What had started as my personal battle had become a movement. By the end of the meeting, the board was visibly shaken. They tried to maintain control, gaveling down angry homeowners and insisting that rules are rules. But it was obvious, the tide had turned. As I left that night, Max trotting happily beside me, I realized something important. This wasn't just about saving my dog anymore. It was about dismantling a broken system, one that had gone unchecked for too long. The board might have thought they could silence me, but now they were facing an entire community that had found its voice. And I had no intention of letting that voice go quiet. The HOA had picked this fight, but now the whole neighborhood was ready to finish it. The HOA meeting was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the fight. If anything, it only pushed the board to dig in deeper. They weren't just embarrassed, they were enraged. For years, they had operated like untouchable monarchs, issuing fines and threats without resistance. Now, suddenly, their authority was unraveling in front of their eyes. And when people like that feel cornered, they don't back down. They lash out. The retaliation came swiftly. Within a week of the meeting, I received a notice claiming that my lawn was not up to community standards. This, despite the fact that it was neatly mowed and better maintained than half the yards on my street. 2 days later, another letter arrived. My mailbox, apparently, was unapproved. Then came a violation for leaving my trash bin out for longer than 30 minutes. It was obvious what they were doing, weaponizing every rule they could find in an attempt to bury me under paperwork and penalties. But instead of intimidating me, it only made them look desperate. And it gave me more ammunition. Every notice, every baseless accusation, went straight into my evidence binder. Page after page, it was becoming a thick catalog of harassment. Meanwhile, the fines for Max continued to climb. According to their records, I now owed over $4,000. They weren't actually expecting me to pay it, they were building a case, hoping to justify placing a lien on my home. That was their endgame, force me to either comply or lose everything. But they underestimated just how prepared I was becoming. By this point, I had retained an attorney. A sharp, no-nonsense professional who had dealt with rogue HOAs before. She was fascinated by the case, and when I showed her my binder, her eyes lit up. She told me bluntly that the HOA was skating on thin ice. Their pet restrictions were unenforceable, their fines were arbitrary, and their harassment opened them up to potential lawsuits. We began preparing a formal complaint. Not just to stop the fines, but to hold the board accountable for their misconduct. The plan was to hit them where it hurt most, their finances and their credibility. If it went to court, they wouldn't just lose. They'd be exposed. But even as I strengthened my legal position, the social pressure continued to mount. The news story had gained traction, and more local outlets were picking it up. One radio station even invited me to speak about my experience, framing it as part of a larger issue of HOA abuse. Listeners called in to share their own stories, some far worse than mine, and the public outrage grew. The board, of course, despised every second of it. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was electric. The room was packed again,
and the board looked visibly worn down. They tried to carry on with business as usual, but the homeowners weren't having it. People demanded answers, demanded accountability. One even stood up and called for a recall election on the spot. The board president, the very neighbor who had first scowled at Max, tried to maintain composure, but her voice shook as she defended their actions. She claimed they were simply upholding the community's standards, but nobody was buying it anymore. The audience was hostile, booing her attempts to shift blame, shouting down her excuses. I sat quietly in the back, letting it unfold. This wasn't my fight alone anymore. The community had taken it up as their own. And that, more than anything, was what terrified the board. They weren't fighting me. They were fighting everyone. But the more cornered they became, the more reckless their behavior grew. A few days later, I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my door. It declared my property in violation of multiple bylaws and warned that further action would be taken if I didn't comply. It looked official, but when I examined it closely, I realized something shocking. It wasn't signed by the full board. It had only one name at the bottom, the president's. That was a violation in itself. Major decisions like fines and notices were supposed to be approved by the entire board, not just one person acting unilaterally. My attorney practically laughed when I showed her. She said this was exactly the kind of overreach that judges despised. It turned our already strong case into an airtight one. Still, it was unnerving to see how far they were willing to go. The board wasn't just abusing power, they were outright breaking their own rules to get at me. And while I felt confident with the law on my side, I couldn't ignore the toll it was taking. The constant letters, the threats, the hostility, it was exhausting. Max, as always, was the one thing that kept me grounded. He had no idea about the chaos swirling around him. He just wagged his tail, nudged me for walks, and curled up by my side each night. To him, life was simple. And in a way, that simplicity reminded me why I was fighting so hard. Because this wasn't just about one dog. It was about living without fear of bullies hiding behind paperwork. It was about proving that no one, not even a power-hungry HOA, was above accountability. By the end of the month, my attorney was ready to file. We had the documents drafted, the evidence compiled, and the strategy mapped out. Once we pulled the trigger, the board would be dragged into a legal battle they had no chance of winning. But just before we filed, something unexpected happened. One of the board members, quiet, reserved, and usually a background figure, reached out to me privately. He said he wanted to talk. That moment changed everything. When the board member reached out, I wasn't sure what to expect. For weeks, the board had operated like a single machine, cold and unyielding. The idea that one of them might break rank seemed too good to be true. But the message was clear, he wanted to talk privately, away from the rest of the board. We met at a local coffee shop, neutral ground far from prying eyes. He showed up looking nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. His first words were simple but heavy with meaning, "I can't do this anymore." What he shared next left me stunned. According to him, the board president had been manipulating everything from the start. She had pushed the dog restriction issue herself, twisting vague wording in the bylaws to justify her personal vendetta. The other board members had gone along, some reluctantly, because she bullied them into silence. But that wasn't all. He revealed that the HOA's finances were a mess. Funds collected from fines and dues were being mismanaged, used for community projects that never materialized, or worse, redirected without proper documentation. He admitted that he had seen irregularities in the books but had been too afraid to speak up. Now, with the neighborhood turning against the board, he felt it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. He didn't want to be caught in the wreckage. I sat there listening, my coffee growing cold as he laid it all out. The corruption went deeper than I'd realized. This wasn't just about Max. This was about a president who thought she was untouchable, wielding her position like a weapon. And now, I had someone on the inside willing to hand me the ammunition I needed. Before we parted, he slid an envelope across the table.
Inside were copies of financial records, documents showing questionable transactions and discrepancies that couldn't be explained away. He whispered that there was more if I needed it, but this was enough to prove what I already suspected: the board wasn't just overreaching. They were corrupt. When I got home, I added the documents to my binder. The evidence was no longer just about harassment. It was about fraud, mismanagement, and abuse of power. My attorney's reaction was immediate and fierce. She said we now had grounds not just for a lawsuit but potentially for criminal charges. Meanwhile, the pressure on the board continued to grow. The neighborhood was restless, and the once untouchable president now found herself at the center of a storm she couldn't control. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was palpable. The room buzzed with anger, and the board sat stiffly at the front, visibly uneasy. When the financial questions started rolling in from homeowners, their answers were vague and evasive. People noticed. Murmurs of "where's the money?" and "show us the books" filled the air. The president tried to steer the meeting back to order, but the crowd wasn't having it. For the first time, she looked rattled, sweat forming at her temple as she insisted everything was under control. The homeowners didn't believe her. They wanted answers. They wanted transparency. And I knew, with the evidence in my possession, the answers weren't going to be pretty. The following week, I decided it was time to strike. With my attorney's help, we filed our complaint, not only contesting the fines against Max but also demanding a full financial audit of the HOA. We sent copies of the filing to every homeowner in the community, making sure no one could claim ignorance. The reaction was explosive. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now voiced their outrage openly. A petition circulated calling for the immediate removal of the president and several board members. Within days, more than half the community had signed it. The whispers of a recall had become a roar. The board fought back, of course. They sent out letters claiming the accusations were false, that the documents were taken out of context. But the damage was done. The cracks in their armor were widening, and no amount of denial could patch them up. The homeowners had tasted the truth, and there was no going back. And through it all, Max remained the unknowing center of the storm. Neighbors who once barely noticed him now stopped during walks to pet him, telling me to hang in there and don't give up. He had become a symbol not just of defiance against unfair rules, but of the community's collective frustration with being controlled. The dog they had tried to ban had become the rallying point for change. But the president wasn't finished yet. A week after the complaint was filed, I found another letter taped to my door. This one was different. It wasn't typed, it was handwritten, scrawled in angry ink. It didn't carry the HOA letterhead. It wasn't official. It was personal. The message was short, but its venom was unmistakable. You think you've won, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't over. I stood there on my porch, the paper trembling in my hand. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just a fight over bylaws or fines. It had become something darker. Personal. Dangerous. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew the final battle was still ahead. The handwritten note was the final confirmation of what I already knew: this wasn't just about power anymore. It was personal. The HOA president, once smug and untouchable, was unraveling, and her desperation was spilling into threats. But in that unsteady scrawl, I didn't see intimidation. I saw weakness. She knew her empire was collapsing. I handed the note to my attorney the next morning. She shook her head, saying it was further evidence of harassment, possibly even intimidation. It went into the binder with everything else, another nail in the coffin. We decided then that the time had come to go all in. The lawsuit had already been filed, but now we pushed harder, demanding a full audit and preparing for a recall vote. The news picked up the story again, this time with a sharper angle, not just about a dog, but about an HOA accused of financial mismanagement and abuse of power. The spotlight grew hotter. Reporters called, neighbors whispered, and the pressure built to a breaking point. The turning point came at the next HOA meeting. Word had spread, and by the time I arrived, the community center was overflowing. People stood in the aisles, crowded at the back, spilling out the door. The atmosphere buzzed with energy, anger, hope, anticipation. The board sat at the front, stiff and pale under the fluorescent lights. The president, normally so composed, looked gaunt, her eyes darting nervously. When the meeting opened, she tried to run it like usual, rattling off agenda items as if nothing had changed. But the crowd wasn't listening. The first homeowner who spoke demanded answers about the missing funds. Another demanded to know why fines had skyrocketed under her leadership. Then someone shouted about Max, calling the entire ordeal a disgrace. The room erupted in applause. The president pounded her gavel, insisting on order, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. The more she tried to control it, the more chaotic it became. People waved copies of the complaint in the air, some even holding enlarged printouts of the financial records I had been given. Her own lies were staring back at her in black and white. Finally, a homeowner stood and made the motion everyone had been waiting for, a vote to recall the president and dissolve the current board. The room fell into a stunned silence for a moment, then cheers erupted. Papers were passed out, votes collected. For years, the board had ruled without question. Now, their fate rested in the hands of the very people they had tried to bully. When the votes were tallied, the result was overwhelming. The president and two of her closest allies were removed effective immediately. The crowd cheered like a stadium after a winning goal, the sound echoing off the walls. For the first time in years, the homeowners felt free. The aftermath was swift. A new interim board was elected, composed of neighbors who promised transparency and fairness. One of their first acts was to rescind all fines against me, wiping the slate clean. Max was officially recognized as compliant with community guidelines, his status no longer in question. The stack of threats, notices, and penalties all gone with the stroke of a pen. But the story didn't end there. The audit my attorney pushed for revealed the truth: thousands of dollars unaccounted for, expenses that couldn't be explained, funds siphoned into pet projects that never existed. The findings were turned over to state authorities, and whispers of criminal charges began to circulate. The once feared president, who had tried to use her power to drive out my dog, now faced the possibility of answering for much more serious crimes. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The letters stopped arriving, the harassment ended, and the neighborhood began to heal. People who had once kept their heads down now greeted me with smiles and thanks. Max became something of a local celebrity. Kids asked to pet him, neighbors joked about electing him mayor of the neighborhood, and even strangers from nearby communities came to meet the dog who brought down the HOA. One evening, as I watched Max chase a ball across the yard, I thought back to that first letter taped to my door. At the time, it had felt like the beginning of a nightmare. But in the end, it had sparked something bigger, a fight for fairness, for accountability, for community. The HOA had tried to ban my dog. Instead, they had exposed themselves, toppled their own corrupt leadership, and united the neighborhood against them. And as Max trotted back to me, ball in mouth, tail wagging, I couldn't help but smile. They thought they could bully me into silence. They thought they could take away my family. But they had made one mistake too many. They underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect what mattered most. The HOA had tried to ban my dog. Big mistake. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe for more viral HOA, Karen, and pet revenge stories. Backhand index pointing right. Comment below if you've ever dealt with a nightmare HOA or neighbor. We'd love to hear your story. Backhand index pointing right. Share this video to spread the word. No one should be bullied for loving their pets.